in my generation were mentoring each other. There were no older people to lead us in gender issues, certainly not in philosophy. There were a couple in history and sociology. Two issues that we were developing then seem to me, in retrospect, extremely important. I should mention that the feminists in biology and in the social sciences had been writing already for 6 to 8 years. There was a considerable amount, I mean, not a lot, but there was a significant presence of feminist biology and feminist sociology, history, and other social science disciplines that were relevant to how we thought about science, in the social science disciplines, so how we thought about the history of science, the sociology of science, and so forth. One of the issues we were pretty clear about was that gender stereotypes and their male supremacist commitments, not to put too fine a point on the issue, selected scientific questions, hypotheses, concepts, methods, and standards of even the best biology and social science, not just the worst. And I don't think we quite knew what to do with that, the problem of the best. And we didn't have the language of social constructivism in the kind of way it would subsequently develop. But we certainly were really clear about the idea, namely that the sciences were constituted through their androcentric projects. And in particular, if you read those early biologists and social scientists, you can see them all raising questions about the objectivity of this research, about the model of rationality, about what counts as good method, about what counts as real science, real sociology, real biology, and so forth. The second issue that already had emerged and was beginning to circulate around, that in retrospect I think was immensely important, was standpoint theory. In Dorothy, the Canadian sociologist acknowledged Dorothy Smith, now retired from Boise, had given a paper in 1972 on women's perspective as a radical critique of sociology. It was published in '74, and I had mimeographed copies of her work in the mid to early '70s. Nancy Hartsock, with whom I was in a reading group for 7 or 8 years, was developing her version of standpoint theory in political philosophy. And Donna Haraway, who has told me she counts herself as a fellow traveler in standpoint theory, which is a good thing since I included her in the feminist standpoint theory reader. So I'm really happy she thinks that was a good place to put her. She was working up at the time her first papers on primatology, which came out in Science in 1978, and taking the standpoint of women and racially subjugated groups in looking at the history of primatology. Standpoint theory can be understood in a number of ways. For one thing, it's a polemical proposal about the power of embedded experience and embodied experience in constituting knowledge. It's also a methodology, an epistemology of science, epistemology and a philosophy of science, and a political organizing tool. It argued that we should start research, we feminists should start research from women's everyday lives in order to, quote unquote, study up. That is, to identify the conceptual and material practices of power. And the target was our particular research disciplines. So Smith was concerned with sociology, Hartsock with political philosophy, and I was with epistemology and philosophy of science. The research disciplines were complicitous with power, was the argument. They worked up the buzzing, blooming, everyday experience into categories and causal relations between them that permitted the few to rule the many. So I think those two understandings, the kind of three were just really powerful. One was differences between women. I can remember that the first attempt to bring race and gender together around science that I saw, apart from Haraway's 1978 primatology papers, was the syllabus for a course that biologist Anne Fausto Sterling and historian of medicine, Evelyn Hammonds, had taught at Brown and MIT back in about that time. So it was race, gender, and science, and I just, carried it around next to my heart. It was a wonderful resource. I think we feminists had little sense of the full ways in which our own work was socially situated in racial and class and global context. We had some sense of it. We were anxious about women of color, what would they say about our work. But I don't think we really had a full sense of it. A second issue is the science and empires issue. That would not get visible to us, or I think in English pretty much to anybody, for several years later. That is post-colonial science and technology studies, the whole rise of the fields of indigenous knowledge and traditional environmental knowledge, and the relevance of women in development, that literature and those projects, to feminist STS. It was a women in development at that point, and I don't think we saw at that point the possibilities for the incredible power that discourse turned out to have once it turned into a discussion of how development rides on the backs of peasants and women, which happened about a decade later, Third World Development. The third blinders, the third thing we couldn't see was the effects of something that had happened in 1972, namely the internet. And we didn't see how that was going to change science and technology in production and communication in a huge variety of ways, in which it subsequently has. Finally, will I have a minute? 30 seconds? Okay. Finally, I think there was then an imperfect fit between feminist science studies and the history and philosophy of science. I'm not sure in 1977 we could see the sociology of science, sociology of science yet, scientific knowledge. We could see the very lively residues of the 60s around science and technology, physicians for social responsibility, the anti-Vietnam War and anti-militarism of that movement, the civil rights movement, and so forth, and its science issues, but we really couldn't see, at least I don't recollect being able to see sociology of scientific knowledge then. Okay, the imperfect fit. First of all, feminist science studies was politically engaged. We wanted to change science and technology, not simply to tell its history, to do a sociology of it. We wanted to change the way it was practiced. Feminism needed it practiced in different ways. We needed women's scientific issues addressed, scientific and technological issues. We needed the ways in which science and we needed scientific sexism ended. We changed the particular kinds of projects that already existed. Secondly, the history and philosophy of science had a very restricted sense of both history and the social. Gender relations were not part of them. Evidently, all the scientists had no gender, historically. They were just humans, rational humans or not. I'm so sorry, I can't read my own scribbles here. So first of all, a restricted sense of history and society. I think women were regarded as part of nature, and so too were gender relations. They were somehow natural relations, or at least outside the range of what counted as the social and the political. And a third aspect of the imperfect fit was that feminism was resistant to choosing sides between the modernism within which liberation movements had functioned in the past and within which science functioned, on the one hand, and the postmodernism, which was emerging at that moment those moments in literature, in the humanities, in cultural studies. Modernism was androcentric. Postmodernism, post-structuralism, seemed at least androcentric, but even worse, it didn't seem to have any future. It was not clear there was no way to grab onto a kind of politics for the future, for redesigning, transforming science and society, and feminism needed that very much. And I would just ask, is this imperfect fit still the case today between feminist science studies and, let's say, 4S? Thank you.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank David Hess for inviting me to participate on this plenary panel. The theme of this meeting is ways of knowing. And just as some ways of knowing have been and continue to be more valued than others, so too have differential values been placed on what needs to be known and what is worth knowing. Since the mid-1950s, sociologists of science have produced a number of books on various groups within the scientific community. At this point, I think I probably need to back up a bit and give you a bit of biographical information that will give you a framework for my remarks. I'm a sociologist. Got my PhD from the University of Chicago at the same time that Jo Freeman got her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. So, 30 years now. I have been very much involved in a lot of issues concerning feminism, feminist studies, race, gender, and ethnicity. So, as I said, since the 1950s, sociologists of science have produced a number of books on various groups within the scientific community. However, there has been no major published study of the role performance of Black American scientists, despite the fact that they have been present among professional scientists in the United States for more than a century. There have been, however, some notable works on Black American scientists. For example, my colleague, Willie Pearson Jr., also from Georgia Tech, his work on race and universalism in the scientific community, and most recently, his book, Beyond Small Numbers, Voices of African American PhD Chemists. To date, the social science knowledge base on scientists of color remains underdeveloped. A disproportionate amount of the published literature on scientists of color is produced by non-social scientists and focuses on biosketches and bean counting. Moreover, several of these publications have serious methodological flaws. Ironically, social studies of science scholars haven't shown the attention to scientists of color to the extent of that from the Congress, government, and funders from both the private and public sectors. This is all the more remarkable given both the current and projected demographic shifts occurring in the US and in other regions of the world. Since the mid-1970s, several publications on women in American science have appeared. However, most of these do not include analyses on minority women or women of color. Consequently, our knowledge of minority women scientists remains rather limited. As a consequence, many of the policies, programs, and practices focusing on enhancing the participation of underparticipating racial, ethnic, and gender groups in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are not being driven by sound research. The growth of the forest community points to the appeal of the subjects of race and science technology and gender and science technology. Yet few social studies of science scholars have focused on the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, and science and technology, with a few notable exceptions, as my colleague mentioned previously. Evelyn Hammonds, for example, and Simon Harkin's own work is a notable exception. Many handbooks and encyclopedias of the social studies of science are considered to be definitive compendia on both the issues and scholars of the social studies of science. However, they rarely include entries on race and ethnicity. As a consequence, there is no good place to get a literature review on multicultural perspectives on science and science studies. However, this is beginning to be addressed by a project that's funded by the National Science Foundation. This project is called Inside the Double Bind, and the purpose of the project is to both identify and synthesize published research literature on women of color in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in the United States. A review of the extant literature on scientists of color, female as well as male, reveals the dearth of the knowledge base. Among the existing gaps in the knowledge base are the following, and these are meant to be illustrative and certainly not exhaustive. The first gap concerns academic origins of female and male scientists of color. And by academic origins, I'm referring to both the baccalaureate and the doctoral origins. Secondly, we have very little research on science and engineering and academia in minority-serving institutions. These are historically black colleges and universities, Hispanic-serving institutions, and tribal colleges and universities. Much more needs to be known about the career paths and patterns of PhD scientists outside of, as well as inside, academia. Productivity trends and dynamics, especially those concerning scientists of color, also need to be studied. And by productivity trends and dynamics, this includes grants, patents, and publications. Also, there needs to be more work on engineers of color to add to the tradition of such work by Joyce Tang, whose work focuses on Asians and Asian Americans in science and engineering. We also need to find out why women of color tend to have higher representation than do white women in some male-dominated fields, such as engineering and computer science. In fact, increasingly, some researchers advocate that the acronym STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, be, how can I put it, deconstructed, so that engineering is indeed separate and apart. It's structured differently, its dynamics and reward systems differ from those in science and math, for example. So we think at this point in our work, it's important to make those distinctions. I think it's also important to state unequivocally that work on race and ethnicity in the social studies of science need not be done only by people of color. The gaps I've just briefly outlined in the literature suggest opportunities for social studies of science scholars to play a significant role in developing a more robust research literature on female and male scientists of color, in the United States as well as in other nations. Thank you.
Next speaker is Lee Starr.
Okay, I have a public service announcement, which will not count for my 10 minutes. Nina Wakeford has already begun the presidential plenary, which will take place on Friday afternoon, and she asks that you take some time to look at the videos which are in the hotel lobby as you come in the front door, and to engage in a game of cat's cradle, literally, not figuratively, with the students that are there, who will be there until 8 o'clock this evening and all of tomorrow morning. That hopefully won't be too much of a burden, but rather a pleasure. My notes on this talk are all over the place because that's how it has been for me with feminism and science. I won't go chronologically because I want to start out with a story that, something very important that I learned from Sandra Harding, which is in 1977, I was just beginning graduate school and lived in she testified, a very tiny house in San Francisco. And Sandra came over to help us plan and, I guess, strategize and get up to all kinds of mischief in planning an event which was, to my knowledge, the first thing of its kind at the AAAS, which was a panel on feminism and science, which took place in 1978. What I learned from her, because we had set up for her to come and give a colloquium at UCSF where I was that whether or not you get tenure mostly depends, if you're a woman, on what kind of shoes you wear. And Sandra proceeded to trot out these perfect beige 1-inch heel pumps that she called her tenure pumps. And it worked. It totally worked. And ever since then, I've been mentoring graduate students and telling them, well, sometimes if they're female, sometimes if they're male, to wear such pumps, and they would be sure to get tenure. The panel that we organized was interesting, and I want to tell you a little bit about it. Interesting in a number of ways, some of which make me a little sad in retrospect that we haven't yet gotten to 1978, perhaps in this imperfect fit that she was talking about. But the panel consisted of people who thought about science, and I may get some of this wrong in terms of the people who were there, but one of the speakers was Mary Daly, a feminist philosopher and theologian, and I would also say methodologist, addressing some issues that we as a community have returned to again and again, but she used to, I was her research assistant when I was an undergraduate, and she used to teach me to go into the library and the right books would fall into your hand, whether you wanted them or not. And I have found this to be absolutely true. It's a little harder online with the new electronic searching. I haven't quite figured out what to do. But part of her methodology training was to think in terms of feminist activism and in terms of feminist theory, but also more generally about the world. She had this model that she called spooking, sparking, and spinning, meaning in the first instance to find out where the ghosts were, to find out what shibboleths you're really dealing with when you start to go in and study an institution or a class of problems. Sparking had to do with allowing yourself free rein to think what we now call lateral thinking across, and especially to do that with other people in a free kind of way that wasn't, you weren't supposed to be correct in any particular way. That was really the lesson of a lot of her lessons. And then spinning, which is rigorously to think about those ideas that have come up in a group of people together. So she was on the panel. Beverly Smith, a well-known activist, feminist activist and anti-racist activist in the health arena, was there. Sandra was also there, I was there. Janice Raymond, another theologian who was a collaborator, sometime collaborator of Maren Daly's. Ruth Hubbard was there, with whom I had also worked. Interesting. Anybody wants to talk to me about this later, I can talk about different approaches to it. But Ruth taught an undergraduate class that I took in gender and science. And her approach to it was, this was in 1974, 75, 76. So this is a while ago, precisely that period where Sandra was saying there isn't so much to look at. And her approach to this was to look at published science and to look at questions of anti-racism and feminism within the published science. And since her area was biology, is biology and evolutionary biology, this meant that we went back and read Darwin and tried to figure out what he was thinking about from precisely those points of view, which hadn't been overrepresented, shall we say, in my previous curriculum in biology. And we produced a book called Women Look at Biology, Looking at Women, which came out in 1979, which again was kind of not the first, but was out there in examining the science itself and looking at this class of questions. What to me is very important about this, also attending the meeting, where Donna Haraway has been mentioned here before, and a novelist named June Arnold, who wrote one of the first gender-neutral pronoun-using novels. That was quite a wonderful attempt called The Cook and the Carpenter. I also want to mention that right alongside this, I had become involved in starting a new feminist journal called Sinister Wisdom, which is a lesbian feminist journal. I was the poetry editor. And we also included a very active anti-racist stance. And I, as poetry editor, had the opportunity to work with a lot of poets of color who were just getting their start in life, and some older, very well-established poets like Audre Lorde, but Achille Bejas, Cherie Moraga, Christos were among the people that published there. And we also published a number of articles critical of specific aspects of science. And I was at that time looking at the brain, which I kind of returned to a little bit, but got away from after my thesis. What was unusual about all of these groups is that the work of any part of that community was just as important as any other part. And so that a poem or a novel could speak directly to a piece of feminist theory, could speak directly then to a very traditional piece of science. The borders were much, much more open about what counted and where it would count. So one of the things that I really miss, and this is for me still a bit of an imperfect fit, although I've tried in the last 2 years to make it a little better fit, is the connection between our lives. Gabrielle Actis said at the council meeting, we just got out of a 5-hour meeting, that some of us want lives. Like, that's an issue, and it is indeed an issue for most of us at this stage in history. But our lives were intertwined with activism, with poetry, with novels, with science, and all around in a kind of very interwoven way. And I think one of the things that happened during the 1980s as both gender and science and women's studies became more professionalized and more academic, or in the academy became more professionalized. I want to say that all of feminist activism by any means. Really, in a way, we sewed ourselves up a bit and began to move a little bit away from that kind of wonderful promiscuity that had blossomed in the 1970s. Not totally, by any means, but I think if I could dream of anything, getting forward to 1978, of our community here, it would be to welcome again and open again a lot more of those doors. And I think if you, especially if you go to Nina's plenary, which has already begun, and then come on Friday to the plenary, you'll get some sense of what doors that might open. Let's want to mention one more kind of thing that we were very involved in the 1970s, and that is anti-ageism. I produced an issue of Sinister Wisdom that dwelt on that, including a biography of the lesbian activist Mabel Hampton. And one of the things that I see taken very casually by the Academy, even though you're not supposed to, is the idea of ageism. I suppose I'm a bit more entitled to talk about it now, 25 years later, 30 years later. It's just that it's kind of a non-issue. And I actually, a friend of mine, Howard Becker, the well-known sociologist, and I were talking a few weeks ago, and he had a friend who's somewhere in his 60s, who's an exquisite sociologist, excellent sociologist. And my friend Howie had inquired about whether there might be a post for him at another university, and he was wanting to move on. And the search committee person said, is he over 60? And Howie said yes. He said, well, don't even bother applying. And just like that, so I think that's an issue that we could return to and examine, and perhaps return to as a community and examine. I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. So,
Our last speaker is Judy Wiseman from Australia National.
Good evening. I'm really delighted to be here too. I mean, who can resist an opportunity to reminisce about the 70s? It was very tempting, but don't worry, I'm not going to do it for too long a time. So far, all the speakers really have spoken from an American perspective about STS and feminism at that time. And although I'm an Australian, in fact, I spent the 1970s in Britain, in the UK. And in 1977, I was in Cambridge, and I arrived from Melbourne, Australia as a Marxist, and I soon began to morph into a socialist feminist, what was known then as a socialist feminist. And second wave feminism was really flourishing at that time in Australia. In Britain, there were lots of women's liberation conferences going on all around the country, and we were often in rented vans going off to these places, drinking bad tea and sleeping on bad floors. And the big political issues of the women's movement at that time were equal pay, access to birth control, abortion, maternity leave, domestic violence, challenging sex stereotypes, and getting women into manual trades. As a student at that time, I was very involved, and this is similar to the other speakers, with a lot of other women critiquing academic disciplines, not leaving any discipline untouched, and developing critiques of the way in which all of these disciplines embody genders' ways of knowing. But while the other speakers have really focused on science, I must say that for many of us in Britain, the issue of technology was just as formative in our thinking. And I well remember the mystification surrounding early computing. An activist friend of mine was one of the early women computer scientists. And I remember she tried to explain to our group that computer programming was just like following a knitting pattern. Now, this wasn't much good to me, as that I was never able to knit, but I did really appreciate her attempt to feminise the technology, even at that point at the beginning of what was known as the microelectronic revolution. And at that time, we were very anxious about the impact that microelectronics were going to have on women, particularly on office workers. And these anxieties were really twofold. Firstly, the fear that the computerisation of secretarial skills and typist skills would render thousands of women redundant. And secondly, there were a lot of health concerns about the screens at that time, about pregnant women sitting in front of screens, a lot of health politics around those issues. And during that period, Harry Braverman's book, Labour and Monopoly Capital, was published in 1974. And it really marked a huge revival of interest in Marxist analysis of technology. Rather than seeing technology simply as the motor force of history, Braverman's analysis was really saying that Marx crucially understood how class relations, antagonistic class relations, shaped the relations of production, and that capitalism was continually trying to de-skill workers, cheapen and fragment workers by the application of new technology. So there were lots of studies about the impact of technological change on work. But the workers that we read about at that time, and I mean I would have described myself in 1977 as an industrial sociologist, a term that quickly went out of fashion, we were always reading about male workers. Now, I think this challenge to the notion of technological determinism, though, did really pave the way for the development of a feminist analysis of gender and technology. We pointed out that labour process discussions and arguments, and I was in a group then called the Conference of Socialist Economists, and we had a journal called Capital and Class. And in that context, we were very much pointing out that the social relations of production weren't exclusively class relations, that we really needed to map gender onto class, and that women's exclusion from technology and technical trades had really advantaged men. And so we were really linking women's lack of technical skills and low pay to the gender relations of technology. Now, I would say at that time that we were very aware of class differences among women, so I have a slightly different position to Sandra at that time. I agree that we weren't sensitive enough to race issues, but in my view, a lot of the history of feminism has been written as if we didn't think at all about differences between women, and for me, I don't think you can think about low pay and jobs without thinking about class differences. Now, one of my fondest memories of that period was being in a Capital Volume 1 feminist reading group. And I'm proud to say that we got through the whole of Volume 1, but were defeated by Volume 2. Although I think we agreed that we kind of got Marx's point by then anyway. But we did need to move on, because at that point in the mid-70s, we thought that technology was about industrial manufacturing. And so we had a mainstream idea as to what technology was. Now, meanwhile, the other debate that was raging at the time, I say raging actually, in my life it felt like it was raging, was the debate about housework and how could we include this in our analysis of capitalist production. And I spent many hours, and actually I said to some people I spent the best years of my life in the mid-70s when I could have been doing many other things, debating about whether one could think about housework as being productive or unproductive labour in Marx's terms. At the same time, Anne Oakley, a British sociologist, published a book called The Sociology of Housework. It came out in 1974. And so during the 1970s, really, housework began for the first time to be taken seriously as work, as a form of labour. And really what we were engaged in was redefining work to include unpaid housework, just as quite a lot of political campaigns at the time, such as Wages for Housework, were also bringing this to the fore. Now, I don't think household technology, though, really made it onto the agenda until people like Ruth Schwartz-Cohen were writing in 1976 her article, The Industrial Revolution in the Home, where she argued that one should think about the Industrial Revolution as crucially taking place in the domestic sphere as well as in the industrial sphere. And for many of us, it was a real shift in perspective to see the home as filled with technologies, not just factories that had been our exclusive focus. And our first social shaping of technology book was subtitled How the Refrigerator Got Its Hum, to really signify how an STS perspective can be brought to bear on even what seems like a very mundane technology. So I would trace the rich analysis of household technologies, from washing machines and electricity to telephones, to this period. And of course there was Ruth's very famous remark that I held on to for many years about the fact that there were histories of all kinds of technologies that you could find in the library, but not one written on the history of the baby bottle, just seen as a kind of ordinary, taken for granted technology. So all of this was really part of a feminist project to redefine technology as not only to do with male activities, and it was part of, as well, rediscovering women inventors in a way that was really paralleling the rediscovery of women scientists. And all of these perspectives made us very aware of the need to push women into computing and engineering so that the design of the world wouldn't be left to men alone. And this is certainly an unfinished job and an unfinished revolution. Now, the other area, of course, that was very important in terms of gender and technology debates was the sphere of biological reproduction. Birth control was a major issue, not only for second-wave feminism, but earlier feminisms, and certainly contraceptive technologies were firmly on the agenda in 1977. Schuler's Firestone, The Dialectic of Sex, had been published in 1970 and was still resonating with its emphasis on the need to free women from the tyranny of reproduction. Patriarchy was seen as fundamentally about the control of women's bodies, their sexuality and fertility by men, and women were demanding technologies that would enable us to take control of our bodies, to have control over birth control, but also to wrest back control of childbirth from male doctors. And I remember how empowering it was to be able to go to a feminist self-help group for pregnancy testing, advice on different contraceptives, being in a self-examination group, and all of these things being about getting to know our own bodies and challenging the knowledge and expertise of what was then a predominantly male medical profession. I think it's hard to remember now that medical technologies and biotechnologies are such a huge area of STS, and I think it's clear if you look at the program here, that feminists were already developing an STS perspective on biotechnologies in the 1970s. Whatever the politics of some of the radical feminist campaigns at the time against reproductive technologies, I think it was clearly understood that the issue wasn't simply the use and abuse of science and technology, but that technoscience had politics, that gender relations had profoundly structured the form of reproductive technologies that had become available, and that women's choices were constrained by what technologies were available to them and what were not. So that's very quickly my reflections on 1977. I'm really looking forward to a great conference. I think one thing's for sure, that we never dreamt in 1977 that STS would be such a successful adventure, and that we never dreamt that feminists would be such major players in our enterprise. Thank you.
Questions or comments, and you can name somebody or just ask the panel as a whole. There we go. Thanks.
I would like to give the question back to you, Sandra, that you left us with on where you think feminist studies are right now, having been around the 70s and today, and where do you think we stand? Because I'd be glad to get your thoughts on that, the great question that you posed to us.
I don't think I know the answer to that, but one thing I'm thinking about is that the marvelous focus on ethnographies of labs and field sites and so forth, and which have been so important to my own work. I mean, they're so valuable, but their displacement from macro structures, and so global economic, political structures within which science today is so tightly wedded to militarism, transnational corporate profiteering, and such, and nationalisms of one sort or another. It's not that gender and imperial issues never enter such studies. Of course they do. Certainly one can think of early on Sharon Trawick thinking about gender in the laboratory in high energy physics. Nevertheless, it's kind of a tragedy of a sort. I mean, the studies are so important, but at the same moment that feminism and the post-colonial and anti-racist literatures were beginning to build in other fields, the sociology of scientific knowledge, that part of STS, took itself to lab studies. I'm not imputing any causal relations or anything, and as I say, those lab studies, lab and field studies have been extremely useful to me, but it's a phenomenon. And so, I don't know, I think it would be interesting to ask in what ways is there still, I mean, I don't know how to answer my question further. I won't even mention philosophy of science. I mean, I know how to answer it there, but this is not a philosophy meeting. I may be the only philosopher in the room, so just leave that to the side.
Good question? Yes.
I'm not as familiar with the history of science and technology studies as with psychology in my own area, and I wondered if there was a similar split in this field between groups that self-identify as radical and liberal. Feminist groups.
In psychology or?
In science and technology studies or sociology of science or
No.
if not, why not?
But one of the things that happened is that medicine wasn't really much on the table, especially medical research as it has come to be really forefronted in Paris until, I would say, probably the 80s, maybe the late 80s. And the entry of medicine afforded a look at gender issues, transgender issues, sexuality issues, how technology was used in all of that. And there weren't like a million of us, either in this community or, especially in the sub-community of feminists. So I think medicine served as a uniting force. And I also think that it was one of the steps to more macro analysis. I agree with you about the early 80s. I think there's been more and more stuff since then. But I don't, I have a sense that that's good in these communities.
The other place I think of it, but I don't think of it as a huge split, was between feminists who were concerned with bad science, critical of quote-unquote bad science, and the emerging recognition many of us had that bad science was only the tip of the iceberg. The real problem was good science, right? And so the early biology, I'm picking on biology only because it was the main natural science that was being pursued by feminists at that time. I mean, Evelyn Keller was thinking wonderful thoughts about physics, but the largest number of scientists were working in biology and medical areas. They held, in my view, a liberal view that the problem was bias, right, sexist bias in the sciences, and if we could remove that sexist bias, then everything would be fine. But I think that never became a really hostile split. At least I never experienced it as such, because they were doing such heroic work of that sort. And our work was so off the map of the rational. It was out beyond the borders of civilization. Those of us who thought the good side, there was something wrong with good science. I mean, it was just you had to kind of whisper it to each other or something. I mean, people were standing up and yelling at me in public. I mean, in the United States, they did it in Germany for another 2 decades, but they were at it in the United States. I mean, leading sociologists of science would stand up and yell at me in public performances, right? I mean, this is the rational mind at work, right? So I see some laughs from some other people who recognize the phenomenon. But it was never I don't ever recollect experiencing it as a hostile split. I think we both were doing heroic things and Amazonian things in our own particular way, but I don't know if they appreciated us, but I think we appreciated them.
Way in the back there.
Yeah, I'm wondering, looking back at where we've been and where we've come from, where do you see feminism and science and technology studies going, or where would you like to see it go?
One thing I think we see fairly clearly now is in feminist studies of science or just studies of science, the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender. In fact, there's a new reader that's just come out within the last year or so that focuses on that intersection in science studies. So I think that's certainly one major trend that we're seeing.
I mean, what can I say? There's so many answers to that question. I mean, you know, all of us who've been involved in this and in feminist critiques of other disciplines, always on some days, it's the good days and bad days. I mean, you know, I can remember actually, even in the mid-70s, thinking that the gender project would not take very long. I can remember thinking that we could just run some women's studies courses for a few years and that would be the end of it, and we would mainstream and all these issues would be taken up. And that's not the case, and so we're endlessly doing both jobs all the time and doing double work. I always feel like it's double work, doing all the standard work and doing our own work, both doing mainstreaming and making sure that gender issues aren't left out. And I mean, I must say, politically, in terms of feminist STS, I mean, I'm in a few weeks going to speak at a conference on European women in engineering, and, you know, I wish that I wasn't still going to speak about the underrepresentation of women in engineering, the underrepresentation of women in new ICT sectors. You know, some of these issues are new, but some of them aren't, and so it's partly about framing things in new and different and exciting ways, but it's partly keeping a lot of the things that we tried to get going a long time ago to sustain them, actually, to make them kind of durable and embedded. I mean, the word we use endlessly, embedding things.
I'd also just like to underscore what Cheryl has just said from maybe a slightly different angle, or maybe it's the same angle, but when I need answers to theoretical questions within STS, and even in doing things like teaching STS to scientists, which I've done a lot of, the intersection of race, gender, and ethnicity is the best fountain for looking at that. I'm thinking about questions of invisibility and silence, which were the topic of the meetings last year. And also just to understand how multiple perspectives coexist or don't exist. It's just been an incredible source of theory, as well as other kinds of things that you mentioned in your talk. So I think that's important to underscore as well. And I'd like to see more and more and more of that. I've actually taught Gloria Anzaldúa to computer scientists. Some of you are going to attest to that experience, which actually went kind of well.
Well, my own work has gone in a somewhat different direction. You have to remember I'm a philosopher, so it's very spacey things. Take on. I have a book coming out from Duke, University Press, in the spring, entitled Sciences from Below, Feminisms, Post-Colonialisms, and Modernities. And what I'm arguing is that we have insufficiently critically engaged the binary of modern versus tradition. modern versus traditional, modernity versus tradition. That we, in science studies, as in other related fields, we use the modern as a horizon beyond which our thought may not stray. And that this is a serious problem because the contrast between modernity and tradition incorporates gender and race imperial contrasts. It was not possible to take on this kind of topic, I think, that is to interrogate tradition in a kind of parallel way to how the postmodernists interrogated modernity. They turned modernity to face the future, but now we can turn modernity to face what supposedly its past. And this was not possible until modernization and until it became clear from post-colonial scholars that modernization was not identical to westernization. That in fact there are many modern societies around the world today embedded in very specific cultural histories, no differently, one could say, from how the West is embedded in its political and cultural and religious histories. So I think this is an important project because racism and sexism live on inside each other, and one gets to see that really clearly by looking at this contrast. By that I mean that women are always outside of civilization a little bit. We'll never really be as modern as men because we have responsibility for all those natural activities like the apes, you know, raising children, and cooking in the kitchen, and that sort of thing. And on the other hand, the West's others are always feminized. They're not fully as manly, they don't use manly sciences, as manly governments as the West. So each of those hierarchies, with all of its strategies for oppression, lives on inside the other. And this tells me that a lot of us were right when we said you can't defeat sexism without also defeating imperialism and racism, and vice versa. So I think I'm saying in different terms what other people have said too, that the intersections of these various kinds of hierarchies are very important for science studies, and it's very encouraging to see how much of post-colonial studies, for example, and anti-racist studies is on programs such as this 4S one.
Yeah, I'd just like to end this last question that especially for Judy and Lee, you know, where Judy talks about the social economists and lead-ups into wisdom. Are the things that people could explore in the 1970s that it's difficult for us to explore and see today? We've lost various forms of insight, and you know, what you see is lost as well as what's gained in the current state of play.
I think I spoke to a couple of them, but briefly. One is this sense of profligacy and promiscuity was just, it wasn't even that much talk about it, just was, because there was activism all mixed in with all of this. And it was a lot more possible to talk about racism. It was also, I've noticed a lot of backpedaling in language, like the use of the generic noun, just being accepted at meetings, even these meetings. And that, like, it's sort of been, it used to be possible to sort of raise that in however obnoxious a way we did. Not always obnoxious, but sometimes. But it doesn't even feel possible to raise it right now. Like, I feel like I would be ridiculed if I said, you know, no, it's not man hours, no, it's not, you know, whatever. And all that works is to be not only disappeared, but unspeakable. So that's one way.
I mean, I think what's kind of hard, I mean, reminiscence of, it's kind of terribly difficult, but, I remember being in Britain in the 70s, and there was such, it was a left Labour government. There were shop stewards, the trade unions were actually out marching with us on issues of abortion, There were working time debates. I actually did my thesis on industrial democracy and workers' cooperatives. So, that is a very different period in terms of kind of optimism, of kind of change. And certainly, in Britain and Australia now, working hours should be the big campaign, actually. There's endless discussions. I'm sort of writing a bit about time. There's endless discussions about the time squeeze. Endless discussions about work-life balance. That's how the debates are, and they're kind of reframed. But actually, going back to what Lee said, actually everyone's really talking about working time, but it doesn't seem to be easy to mount a campaign against it, except in France, where I guess it's had rather mixed, mixed success. So some things have been lost, but again, I think things are kind of then reframed, because I think partly women's integration into the labour force, men's increase in kind of, housework, whatever the kind of proportion is, have meant that a lot of those campaigns are much more now. The work-life discussions, I think, are much less just about women now, so I think there's been a lot of gains in those terms, in terms of discussions about kind of leave and work and things are much less gendered in a kind of positive way. So,
One last question.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about something that had gone almost completely unmentioned in both Senator Harding's last comment, where I heard the word religion mentioned. I thought it was really interesting that in all of your talks and the discussion that it was never mentioned, whereas in history of feminism and history of women, religion and women are so much bound together. And then also in contemporary, somewhat perhaps more popular discussion of science, the huge topic is religion and science, or religion versus